Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This is our last session. It will be followed immediately by the round table. We'll have this session, some questions, and then the round table. Our first speaker this afternoon is Richard Unger of the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And he will be speaking to us on ships, shipping, technological change, and global economic growth, 1400 to 1800.
Thank you very much. Not all technical changes are created equal. Some have greater impact on the economy than others. Some have more influence, and a very few have shaped entire periods in history. Paolo Malanima, Paul Ward, and Astrid Kender, in their 2013 book, Power to the People, Energy in Europe Over the Last 5 Centuries, talk about technical blocks, that is a group of transformative innovations. Joel Mokyr, in his Lever of Riches, identifies a small number of significant macro innovations. Dick Lipsey and Kenneth Carlaw discuss what they call general purpose technologies. Following Timothy Trachtenberg and Manuel Bresnan, who coined the term, and Elfman Helpman, Lipsey and Carlaw offer an abstract model that describes how GPTs, short for general purpose technologies, work. They define the GPT as a single technology recognizable as such over its whole lifetime that initially has much scope for improvement and eventually comes to be widely used, to have many uses, and to have many spillover effects. While the 19th and even more the 20th centuries offer a number of such GPTs, the period from 1400 to 1800 offers only 2: printing and the three-masted ship. The latter, a product of complex advances in shipbuilding, qualified because of its hard, long-term, widespread effects, extensive spillovers, and because it encouraged further endogenous changes in new practices and improvements or adaptations of existing ones. Most important, it generated economic growth. Any improvements in the efficiency of moving people and goods promotes trade, exchange of information, and specialization in production. In short, cheaper transportation generates Smithian growth. Adam Smith said the division of labor generates economic growth, and that the extent of the division of labor depends on the extent of the market. For him, what he called water carriage was the greatest source of division of labor, and so of improvements in skills and specialization in production. The three-masted sailing ship, through the mechanism Smith described, then offered a wide range of new opportunities for economic growth. The standard pattern of evolution of general purpose technologies, historically, in terms of adoption and impact, has followed a logistic function. The typical pattern of adoption of almost anything new. Here's a stylized form of the logistic curve. In 3 phases, GPTs begin as crude adjuncts to existing practices, then improved so more efficient and more sophisticated, gains wide acceptance, and then use stabilizes, and typically it is replaced by another or other general purpose technologies. The pace of adoption, and hence the slope of the logistic curve, depends on a number of factors, including who controls knowledge of the GPT. The adoption and impact of the full-rig sailing ship emerges from a description in terms of the 3 phases of the logistic curve. Following the path of the impact also indicates how other lesser innovations could be understood as fitting into the general changes in the economy, politics, and communication, among others. The first phase with ships stretched from the 14th century to the early decades of the 16th. It was marked by what some years ago This Canadian medievalist called the great invention of medieval and Renaissance maritime history, the emergence of the three-masted ship. A new design for sailing ships emerged in the 14th century, which evolved over the next 150 years, coming over time to dominate long-distance seaborne transportation. In the Mediterranean, shipbuilders combined the highly modified sailing ship inherited from the Roman Empire with a Northern European vessel, a highly modified version of early medieval cargo ships. The new type that emerged from a combination of the two had a Carvel-built hull. That is, the design of the principal frames determined the form, with the hull planks tacked onto the frames to finish construction. The surface was smooth, lowering resistance against the water. The hull had the tubby shape of the Northern European cog. Power for it came from a single square sail. The rudder was fixed to a straight stern post, not to the side, as in the Mediterranean ship on your right. Sorry. Yeah, you're right. Increasing contact by sea between the North and the South in the late 13th and early 14th century led directly to the development of this merged type in the middle. To the single large square sail, Southern shipbuilders added a small lateen or triangular lateen sail at the stern of the ship. The rig made sailing closer to the direction of the wind easier and gave masters more control over the vessel. The two-masted carrack had all the advantages of the northern cog, with the additional attribute of being better able to hold a course. The last touch was to put a small mast near the bow and so balance the lateen sail on the mizzenmast aft. Well, it existed by 1400. The design was still not able to compete with many other more traditional forms. It took builders time to explore the potential of the new technology. To save labor over time, the sail plan became more divided. The total area stayed the same or increased while the number of sails grew. So each one of those that was on the ship was smaller than had been typical before. Crews handled the sails one after the other, so fewer men were needed for a vessel of the same size. Smaller crews meant greater range over the oceans of the world. Shipbuilders started to develop different designs for different purposes. Carracks were tubby with a deep waist and high castles at bow and stern. Galleons had straight gunnels, that is, not the deep waist that carracks had, and they were narrower than carracks. With galleons that increased speed, eased the shifting of cargo, and improved handling qualities. It's hard to measure the improvement in safety or in the cost of transportation that full-rigged ships brought. At least there are estimates for European lands of labor productivity. They show improvement over time, slow in the first phase, that is up through the 16th century, and slowed down to the early 17th century, and then considerable gains in the second half of the 17th century, and then big jumps in phase 3, just as the use of full-rig ships declined. It took time for exploiting the greater range, higher potential carrying capacity, declining crew size, and specialized designs, all those things put together to pay dividends. Important to the development and success of the full-rig ship, as with any technical innovation, was government indifference, and even better, government support. Various states subsidized the exploitation of the design in voyages to distant and even unknown regions. In the first half of the 16th century, an arms race among Northern European states demonstrated what was maximum effective size. Government promotion of voyages of exploration and to carry traders, soldiers, and emigrants to the Americas and Asia expanded the use of full-rigged ships, increased the numbers built, and gave shipbuilders more opportunities to improve their skills in producing the type, while others giving occasions to try variants. In the second phase of the use of full-rigged ships, these vessels reached all parts of the world. More variants appeared with some standardization in subcategories. Shipbuilders throughout Europe learned to produce full-rigged ships, in some cases hesitatingly, staying attached to older practices, which gradually faded away. By the 18th century, methods of building were consistent everywhere. Dividing the sail plan and increasing the length of the hull relative to its width made it possible for ships to be larger and more seaworthy. Perhaps most effective in lowering costs was the emergence of vessels with features suited to one trade or one set of trades. The Dutch flout, which emerged in the last years of the 16th century for carrying grain out of the Baltic, was perhaps the outstanding example, at least for Northern Europe. A range of other specialized types extending to vessels for the fisheries, like this one from the Newfoundland coast, and warships, like the very famous and, expensive Sovereign of the Seas in England in 1637. The greatest added value with general purpose technologies, and very probably with any technology, comes from the replacing of existing methods with new ones. In the case of the full-rigged ship, efficiency improvements during the second phase came from replacing the ship itself, as investors found more reasons to exploit the improving type. A result was significant gains in labor productivity, which were higher than in almost any other sector of the economy. General-purpose technologies, by definition, generate spillovers in other and usually related fields, and ships did that in the second phase. One obvious spillover was the growth in the scale and stability of shipbuilding sites. The yards saw efficiency improvements from using more cranes and a greater number and variety of tools. The expansion of the responsibilities of government and the appearance of monopoly trading companies in Northern Europe centralized work for larger ships. The resulting yards, like that of the Dutch East India Company, were among the largest industrial enterprises in the world. The greater scope of operation of ships generated a need and a desire for improvements in navigation. Starting from compilations of sailing directions as early as the 13th century, cartographers improved the quality and scope of their maps. By the 15th century, they used printing to make more precise reproductions, and by the 16th century, to make collections of charts which came along with instruction manuals. Those works enjoyed wide circulation. There was an increasing market for them in the schools, in the navigation schools, which began to spring up in port towns. Nautical instrument makers improved the quality and availability of their products. Governments took an interest in tracking the latest information about distant sailing routes, leading Iberian states to set up offices to gather information. Their successors were the government hydrographic offices, which emerged in the early 19th century throughout Europe. Another spillover was improvements in cargo handling in port towns. Civic authorities improved organization on wharves and made provision for easier access to the docks for carts and wagons. There were more and bigger cranes to increase the scale of moving goods. Towns on rivers often moved docking facilities further downstream to be closer to open waters, and so give the larger full-rigged ships with deeper draft easier access to those docking facilities. Port improvements and better navigation promoted the development of better designs for smaller ships, some equipped with sprit sails, for example. These varied types could supplement the long-distance trades that used full-rigged ships. Those smaller boats and ships, some with only one or two sails on a single mast, served to distribute goods to and from major ports to lesser ones. The general-purpose technology generated changes in commerce and settlement. The opening of new trades and trade routes led to an increase in production and also the redistribution of settlement in Europe and in many other parts of the world. It was in long-distance seaborne trade where the impact was most obvious, for example, with faster ways to sail between Europe and the East Indies and India and across the Pacific, establishing somewhat regular contact between Mexico and the Philippines. Already in the 16th century, exchange of goods carried in full-rigged ships led to reorientation of the trading networks on land of indigenous peoples in North America. Ships carried migrants from Europe and from Africa to the Americas. Those immigrants implemented new agricultural practices to produce goods for distant markets. Migrants settled largely along or near the seacoast to have access to seaborne transport. Throughout the world, and especially in Europe, cities on the oceans grew faster than those in the interior. The most important examples were ports in Europe, such as Seville, Lisbon, London, and Amsterdam, those along the Atlantic front. And just point out to you that the first two sets of numbers are a century apart, and the next are only 50 years apart. But that doesn't change the results. The growth is clearly in those seaports on the Atlantic coast. In the third phase, the rate of adoption of full-rigged ships leveled off. There was an erosion in the number of full-rigged ships in use in Europe as improved versions of other types found certain trades where they could supplant the dominant one. Improvements in sailing ships continued, but on a more modest scale compared to advances in Phase 2. Builders did find ways to increase sail area using existing rigging and by replacing the lateen sail on the mizzen with a gaff sail. Similar to a sprit sail, but slightly different in character, but it was a fore and aft sail, so it was easier to handle. More sail area was especially valuable with warships as they grew in size. Even stretching back into the 17th century, the armed full-rigged ship with higher costs of construction, fitting out, and manning had forced evolution on governments. What historians have called the fiscal military state that emerged in the period devoted to finding income sources to finance forces for war was to a significant degree a result of technological developments in shipbuilding. While there were earlier signs of that evolution in the 18th century, the increasing signs of warships, the larger crews, the permanent bases for them combined to expand the scope of government action and make the protection of seaborne commerce a principal goal of states. Ultimately, it was the emergence of the steam engine, a new general-purpose technology, used for propulsion of ships at sea that led to the fading importance of the older GPT with roots in the 14th century. By the third quarter of the 19th century, the majority of tonnage, not till the third quarter of the 19th century still, the majority of tonnage of Western European merchant marines was powered by steam. Technology of sailing ships responded to the competition from steam power, improvements following the earlier paths toward labor saving and lowering risk. In its early days, steam propulsion provided a significant advantage for sailing ships, though. Steam-powered tugs could tow those sailing ships to open water, so they did not have to wait around for favorable winds or tides to get out of the harbor. And so steam tugs cut down on travel time and made the timing of departures and arrivals more reliable. The diffusion of the full-rigged ship technology started in Phase 2 with the sharing of design and construction methods more obvious in Phase 3. The extent of that transfer was slow, a reflection of the lack of institutions to carry out dissemination in other parts of the world. The gains from a switch to full-rigged ships were too small to convince builders in India, China, Japan, and Southeast Asia, and the islands in the Pacific to take on the unfamiliar construction. In Australia, Southern Africa, and the Americas, the full-rigged ship was so different from the existing vessels that two entirely different forms of transportation operated in their own spheres, with the full-rigged ship monopolizing long-distance transport and the carriage of large quantities of goods. In India, there was borrowing of imported technology in the overall design of seagoing vessels and specific diffusion in methods of fastening. Nails replaced the fiber lashing used to attach planks one to the other. Around the Arabian Sea, shipwrights maintained the general principles of traditional construction while adding features borrowed from full-rigged ships. Maritime states on the European Atlantic front established shipbuilding yards for warships and also for cargo ships around the world. Those sites offered examples of how to repair and build smaller ships of European design, but also how to build and repair full-rigged ships. Often the master shipwrights brought from Europe to those sites had to use local materials, and so in the process gained an appreciation of the value of different kinds of wood. The shipyards typically employed local people as unskilled laborers, so they had opportunities to learn about full-rigged ships. The imported carpenters in the process learned about local designs and practices. In the third phase, the arts of ship design and shipbuilding became more formalized, standardized, and institutionalized. Already in the 15th century, descriptive works about shipbuilding appeared. Such books changed over time to careful descriptions of types of construction, works that could be guides for practicing or for apprentice shipbuilders. In the 18th century, authors tried increasingly to give ship design a more rigorous method through the use of mathematics. Controlled experiments with types of ships were rare, but they did start. The new texts were required reading in the first and short-lived schools for shipbuilders in the second half of the 18th century. Knowledge of how to get the most from the hull of a sailing ship increased dramatically in the 19th century, illustrated in published theoretical works on what became a science of shipbuilding. One remarkable result was the fastest full-rig ships ever built. The shipping patterns that the full-rig ships made possible, the shifts in production and populations resulting from its developments led to a sharp increase in global commerce, and so a sharp increase in the total number of full-rig ships in service. European merchant marines grew dramatically through the 18th century. Almost contrary to expectations, it was then in the third phase, with established routes and rising population made possible by trade, that the economic effects of the general purpose technology, as well as political and military ones, were greatest. The continuing improvements in speed and manning requirements of full-rig ships and their impressive descendants in the 19th century kept wind-powered vessels ships competitive. On some routes, where the winds were reliable and commodities of a trade established, sailing ships remained in use well into the 20th century. The advances in shipbuilding, including the improvements in design, along with related developments in various shipping technologies, made a considerable contribution to the long-term growth of the world economy between 1400 and 1800. The lowering of transport costs and the opening of new avenues for trade led to specialization in production and the introduction of new goods to otherwise unreached markets. Technological changes also led to better preservation of the capital good and so decreased losses and increased returns to investment, valuable in a capital-poor world. The more efficient and more versatile ships brought new forms of organization to shipbuilding with large-scale, durable facilities and in commerce with joint stock monopoly trading companies in Europe. The shipping sector offered, in the early phase and in the era of dominance of full-rig ships, sources of growth and resilience for the economy. It is the context of such technological change, with their extensive impact, that should shape the study of any other contemporary technological changes, and indeed should shape the understanding of all history of technology. The three-masted ship and the multitude of spillovers from that development qualifies and indeed defines, not only for the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, but also for the history of the last dozen or more millennia, what a macro-invention or a general-purpose technology was and is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very interesting paper in which you explained to us how the development of the three-masted ship had a really crucial impact on economic growth, but really one of the more interesting facets was your use of the model of the general purpose technologies, and especially articulating the spillover effects and be able to articulate all the ways in which those spillover effects also accelerated economic growth through more efficient cargo handling, better navigation, new trade routes, things like that. So thank you very much. Our second paper this afternoon is by Yulia Altukhova-Nys at the University of Reims, and she will be speaking to us today on productivity, yes, but subject to sustainability, and evidence of reemergence of accounting for sustainability from the French agricultural authors from the 17th to the beginning of the 19th centuries. Yulia.
Thank you very much. Buongiorno a tutti. I am very pleased to be here for my first time, and it's a great honor for me. So, during this presentation, I will present in order the interest of the subject and the research question, the theoretical framework, the methodology of the research, and we'll discuss the main results. 4 decades ago, the first works and researches with the title or subject of environmental accounting, ecological accounting, or accounting for sustainability emerged. As said Gray, accounting for sustainability research has grown in relatively few years from a very marginal area of interest and practice to a diverse and vibrant area of research, teaching, and practice. Moreover, there are so many different approaches to accounting for sustainability. That is why I propose to distinguish these approaches by the development paradigm used. And we can distinguish 3 perspectives of development based on the seminal works of Robert Solow, Herman Daly, Bob Leffen-Hodjaev, and Jacques Richard. The technogenic development is now about conservation of natural or human capitals. And there are infinite possibilities, as the title suggests to us, of substitution of natural capital thanks to the free markets and technological progress. And there is a sustainable development with 2 different perspectives, the weak sustainability and the strong one. They both have on their basis the systematic preservation of natural capital, but only strong sustainability estimates that there is a need to preserve separately different kinds of capitals, like natural or human one, as well as financial one. And for this, we need a system of scientific, physical, environmental limits. And some research has demonstrated that there exists a strong sustainability approach in agricultural accounting for sustainability. That's why I wanted to find some premises for accounting for sustainability in agriculture, even early that the term existed. So, as said Brodel about the term of capitalism, the concept existed even before the term emerged. And this paper aims to demonstrate that there were some premises to strong sustainability in French agricultural accounting, even earlier that the term of accounting for sustainability existed. So, as Charles Kidd, Fressoz, and Locher, Cummings, and Bridgmont works, as in their works, we are looking for the answer to a diachronical question related to sustainability. For this, I was based on different theories of dialectical evolution of capitalism and of economic development in general, and accounting. As mentioned by Colas, accounting participates in and to the capitalist system, and there is interaction between the tool and the system. Concerning farm accounting, there are mostly historical works on English context, but also the French one and Italian one, for example, Rossi, 2013. But generally, there are they are not focused on sustainability issues. So to respond to my research question, I made an observation of practices through selected publications of the farm accounts of the period of 17th, beginning of the 19th centuries. And we have studied in this manner, we have made in this manner a diachronical analysis of sustainability issue. For this purpose, different sources were used: original documents, such as several contemporary works of studied period, and some works on history of accounting, as well as on the rural history, economic and political history. But before discussing this subject, it is necessary to examine the economic and political environment of the time. Like Catchpole et al. And Jacques Richard, we propose to describe and analyze, on the one hand, the accounting context, in which farm accounts have been developed, and on the other hand, the social and political context that has influenced accounting practices and vice versa. So, for this, I propose to distinguish two following periods: the phase that preceded the Great French Revolution of 1789 and the period between 1789 and 1888, because it's in the 1888 that the Ministry of Agriculture in France was founded. So during the reign of Louis XV, agricultural technology stagnated, rural density reached a choking issue, and in 1761 we can observe a creation of the Royal Agricultural Society of Paris, preceded by the emergence of regional agricultural societies. But there were mostly nobles, landowners, and some farmers who applied emerging agronomic theory. However, for almost 2 centuries, throughout the period of the so-called modern Bourbon dynasty, inaugurated by Henri IV and represented by 4 Louis, from Louis XIII to Louis XVI, the gap is widening between the dominant classes and the majority of the population, mainly peasant and rural one, overburdened with taxes and forced into stagnation. So the French society could not endure any longer to rigid royal regime and engaged in the revolution. During the Directoire and the Consular periods, the situation stabilized and the state was concerning of an agricultural revival. The time of the Directoire is linked with the name of the person that might be called the earliest of agrarians. It is François de Neufchâteau. He was Minister of the Interior, and he devoted himself to the study and promotion of domestic production, both industrial and agricultural ones. Remarkably, in 1804, Napoleon supported the reprinting of the work of Olivier de Serres, a leading French agronomist of 16th-17th centuries, proposed by members of the Society of Agriculture. At that time, the dissemination of knowledge, change of agricultural structures made the general increase in living standards. And I selected 3 French authors and their works on agricultural accounting and management in general because of their availability and not for other reasons that I will precise lately. One of the outstanding figures in the history of agriculture was Olivier de Serres. He has been called father of agriculture by Arthur Young. His book From 106,000 Theater of Agriculture contains the innovative future of developing and management philosophy known as a good father management, un bon père de famille, with the aim of preserving the future of farm while seeking to increase its production. Olivier de Serres was one of the first persons to practice reasonable farming in the agricultural field of Pradelle of nearly 2,000 hectares by using crop rotation. He discovers that the lucerne crop enriches the soil and allows the next year higher yields on the ground where it grew. He cultivated the land himself. The Pradelle domain became a laboratory and experimental farm where the intuition of agricultural modernity shoots up and where the test administered empirical proof of the validity of inventions. By reading his book, one can observe some premises to accounting for sustainability. For example, Olivier de Serres indicates on the importance of care of the nature and of soils, as well on the manner of measuring soil and on the distinction of different kinds of soil and corresponding treatments. He is speaking also of the problem of bathhouse work. He stresses the long-term character of activity and importance of care of the natural resources, even if it demands additional costs by quoting the maxim, with work, the property is acquired, and with lands, it is owned, and it costs more to keep than to buy. This kind of approach is similar to historical cost accounting for strong sustainability developed recently in last 4 decades. In this kind of accounting is seeking to take into account all the costs of natural or human capital's preservation. Moreover, Olivier de Serres notes the importance of soil work with science and diligence that could prevent so many scarcity of all of the kinds. So here too we see some premises of accounting to strong sustainability in the sense that the last one refers to different environmental standards. This sentence brings to mind a similar definition of accounting for sustainability by Gray of 1992, a parallel accounting system which provided calculations of what additional costs must be borne by the organization if the organizational activity were not to leave the planet worse off. Christophe Mathieu de Dombasle, son of a former military grandmaster of forestry under the Empire, studied chemistry and agronomy. He also worked in the campaign of Luxembourg as an accountant in the service of the convoys, and he was a member of the Academy of Sciences of the Royal Society of Agriculture. He managed from 1822 and for 20 years the farm of Roville, where he made a private school of farming. He introduced the cultivation of flax in Lorraine, showed the benefit of lime to improve clay soils, and created a famous plough. Despite his efforts, the cereals yield didn't exceed 11 to 12 quintals per hectare. The Calendar of Good Farmer, or Manual of Practitioner Farmer, edited in 1821, had known 7 editions and is the first French agricultural manual of double-entry bookkeeping. But it is especially in the Annales de Roville that he gives us his thoughts on accounting. For Mathieu de Dombasle, the regular accounts were an absolutely essential thing in any farm of some importance if you want to get good results. Mathieu de Dombasle discusses the usefulness of the auxiliary books written in the form of tables, where all operations of every day were brought. The author proposes to hold 23 auxiliary books, stressing that it takes very little time each day. The accounting was held in working hours, in the number of quintals of harvest, etc. One could even say that there are already elements of economic analysis and a draft of the standard cost accounting, but also of accounting for sustainability, because in accounting for sustainability there is also use of quantities and its tracking. Another interesting point in line with accounting for sustainability was the issue of depreciation, concerning notably the land or the soil depreciation that is named land improvement expenditure. It is worth noting that this mechanism is taking also into account the different plant properties like clover for soil restoration and its necessary presence in the aim of preserving the cultivated soil. So there is a preoccupation in some kind for the natural capital soil and its preservation. Finally, Joseph-Marie Auguste Bella was a student of Mathieu de Dombasle, and he founded with Polonceau the school of Grignon, which is actually part of AgroParisTech. He was a military also, Chevalier de l'Empire, and during the Hanover campaign of 1802-1803, he gets sick and was carried by Albrecht Thayer, Royal Doctor and future Director of Agricultural School of Möglin. Auguste Bella proposes, like Mathieu de Dombasle, to open different auxiliary books, and one of their goals is to divulgate an information to different stakeholders, so to different kinds of public and not only to the shareholders. Accounts were opened to various cultures, and Auguste Bella speaks also of land improvement, that is soil preservation, finally. So, the history approach could give us some lessons from the past on agricultural accounting. The period from 17th to the beginning of the 19th centuries is characterized by an important role, by an important support by the state for agriculture, and also the role of société savante in agricultural development. There are mostly large rural areas that are forced to practice accounting. Among them are the farms of Pradelles, of Roville, and of Grignon that contributed to the industrialization of agriculture and built the foundation for the French agricultural accounts. One of the first French publications on agricultural management that we found is the book of Olivier de Serres, and where one can find some premises to accounting for sustainability, notably concerning the land measurement, the crop rotation, and other techniques for the renewal of soil fertility, as well as the social concerns of human capital. And the first double-entry agricultural accounting practices described by Mathieu Dombasle and Auguste Bella see their appearance in the tumultuous years just after the Great French Revolution of 1789 and developed under Napoleon and then under the Second Empire. In the first double-entry agricultural accounting practices, one can see the consideration of natural capital of land to restore by different actions like clearings or extraordinary stone removings, etc. That is also one of the features of accounting for sustainability. At the same time, we should not ignore the fact of progress of science on the development of physical environmental threshold to be respected. 4 centuries ago, soil science was only at its state of germ. However, farmers already kept into account the restoration of vital soil functions. As noted by one of the pioneers of paleontology, of agricultural chemistry, and of study of superficial formations in soils, Bernard Palissy, who invented the notion of restitution, should be give back to land what crops have taken. So my conclusion is in line with the conclusions made by Markus Denzel yesterday. Indeed, accounting is an instrument of vitalization of economic growth and of reduction of entrepreneurial risks, also in agriculture. And I will add that all this is in agriculture on the condition of sustainability, that is the preservation of natural and human capitals. So to speak, some books on the farm accounts contain more information than those of industries, and the authors of these works are somehow agromans, since they gather themselves farmers, agronomists, economists, and teachers. That is the multidisciplinarity future, the wish of so many accounting for sustainability specialists. Thus, even 4 centuries ago, instead of 4 decades, one can find some premises to accounting for sustainability. Thank you very much. Grazie.
Thank you for that welcome focus on agricultural innovations. I don't think we've had enough discussion actually in the Settimana about agriculture, and your further elaboration of the different types of agricultural techniques and especially accounting techniques that were advocated in this new literature that started appearing in the 17th century in France. Since this is a short 2 papers, we're going to go right to the question period. So I'd like to invite you to come up and fill out a question. Anyone? So we will go immediately to the questions. So please come up. Students especially, last opportunity for questions. We will have the round table immediately after this. Would you like to ask a question?
I see Sikkim coming this way. Is that surprising?
Do you want to ask a question? Oh. No, you didn't want to ask a question. Okay. All right. Thank you. Our first question for Richard Unger is from Martinez Male? Malo? Michael. Okay, sorry.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. It's more a curiosity about how the government interacted with this new innovation about 3-masted ships. I think it would be very interesting to know, because I'm thinking also about Athens and in the ancient world when I don't know how to pronounce it in English. Triremes were the product also of investment by, at least according to anecdotal evidence, we know that they were a product of in state support but their role was mostly military. So instead, in this case, it was more commercial. So in a way, maybe it would be interesting to know if even if the interest was in commercial practices, the government was still interested in investing in this. Just a curiosity. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick Ford.
Nick Ford, Lund University. A really interesting presentation, thank you. And I guess following on from the previous session where we also talked a bit about chipping, I'll ask a similar question in relation to technological transfer. Because my curiosity was piqued when you at one point mentioned Australia and the idea that Australia didn't borrow from leading practices around three-masted ships and such because it was so different to what was done in Australia. And coming from there myself, I know it's a long way away from anywhere else, and kind of having access to the rest of the world would have been important. And it leads me to wonder why. What was the sort of the barrier? Why, when you say it was so different, I'm curious as to whether it was they didn't have the know-how, the human capital to apply the necessary techniques, or was it a story of the materials simply weren't available in Australia? So yes, it's a curiosity, but yeah, what was the difference there? Thanks.
Louis Sicking.
Yes, thank you for two very interesting papers. I guess my question is more of a rhetorical nature, but serious. And the question would be, the full-rigged ship, is it a concept or a historical reality? After all, there are many vessels having three masts. They developed over in time, as you explained. And of course, we are now living in times we should broaden ourselves, our perspectives, and so I think this was a great treat to cover 4 centuries, but of course a lot of things happened and developed. And to just put the full-rigged ship into perspective, recent research, for instance, by Casale, has shown that in the Indian Ocean, both the Ottomans and the Portuguese used galleys for a long time into the 16th century, putting this full-rigged ship and its success in perspective. A second example of recent research putting this in perspective is the work by Partesius, who studied the intra-Asian trade of the Dutch in the Far East. And he showed that not only there was an enormous variety of ships used by the VOC within Asia, and he also showed that a lot of smaller vessels, perhaps not being full-rigged ships, did play an important, and there I repeat my argument, having a lot of small ships can make an enormous impact. So this is the second example. And the third example is something which may also be open to debate, but that the most dynamic period of the Hanseatic League, I would say, was that not before the development of the full-rigged ship? That is, the cog had a very simple, it was, if I may say it that way, its technique was quite simple. The most dynamic period of the Hanseatic League being the 13th and 14th century, that is before the period you're dealing with. Now, I know I'm a bit direct, but I'm Dutch, you know, so forgive me my English. I'm not as subtle as those on the islands west of Europe. Thank you.
Right. I also have a brief question for Professor Unger, and it's about the general purpose technologies model itself. And I'm wondering, where does the innovation of shipboard artillery fit into that model? This is a design feature that's very expensive. It's absolutely advocated by governments. So do you perceive it as simply just a spillover effect? Or how do you integrate that kind of development, which was of great importance to the governments? Where does that fit into your model?
Thank you very much for the questions. I think In the instance of government support of technical change in shipping, it's more because of the discovery of potential. That is, once shipbuilders have found ways to make these vessels go further, governments are interested not so much in making the ships better as reaching various points in the world. The coast of Africa is the first and obvious example for Portugal, but then it goes on from there. So there are prizes for improvements in shipbuilding, but they're very, very rare and very, very few. Most of this is done privately. So it's more, what does generate the advances is demand, part of which is from governments, and where it shows up greatest, of course, is in naval vessels. But the fact is that I think the second Columbus expedition, it was about 17 ships, for example. So that it meant demand. And I guess that's also allows me to make another point. Columbus got some beat-up old ship from somewhere down the road to make the first voyage, which meant that shipbuilding, the development of shipbuilding was such that you could get a number of different ships, almost anywhere you could get one of these full-rig ships and cross the Atlantic and get back. On the Australians, the local ship in Southeast Asia, as Louis Sicking pointed out, in Southeast Asia, India, China, Japan, there was an existing and thriving shipping industry and shipbuilding industry. In Australia, it was much more limited. I mean, this is not to say that there wasn't shipping. I mean, after all, I forget the date, but it must be a few thousand years ago, migrants came across the Torres Strait, and they didn't swim. They came on boats. But these vessels, for making contact with places like what is now Indonesia, required something of larger scale. And the local shipbuilding could not scale up, could not imitate. The same thing happened in the West Indies. But it's not, you know, the assumption is, of course, once the Europeans arrived, they had these wonderful vessels and they cleared out everybody. Well, no, that's not true. In fact, these other forms of shipbuilding did continue, and the use of local vessels did continue, gradually, slowly overwhelmed. And in the short term, on long-distance trades, it was European designs. So shipbuilding in Australia becomes European shipbuilding. So it's an exact copy. Whereas in East Asia, South Asia, and the Near East, it was more a combination of the two. Louis Sicking wants to know about historical reality. Now, I needn't remind him that what we do is never going to be reality because we can't recreate it. Also, I know from my reading of William of Ockham that categories that we use are our own creations, although there's some discussion about how real those categories are. So what falls into the category of a full-rig ship, I think, throughout is this combination rig and form of construction of the hull. Now, there are variants on that, and of course, as each year passed, there was a new variant, some regional, some local, some scaled down, some scaled up. Do they fall outside of the category? I obviously tend to give it, to use it rather broadly, to include as much as possible within that realm. That does not say that smaller ships didn't exist, or that ships which were not, there were lots of types that were around that were not based on full-rig ships. There were very few types around that did not depend on the success of full-rig ships, spillovers in other words, that there were spillovers in ship design in many ways over time, creating more effective vessels. As to the Hanseatic League, yes, it is true. It is true that the heyday of the Hanseatic League was in a period when cogs exist, but I'm sorry to say a recent dissertation done in Germany says that the cog is a category created in the 19th century by German nationalists and has nothing to do with reality. I don't subscribe to that story, but it too is contested. But volume, I think you'll agree, the extent of commerce in the Baltic is greater once there's a full-rigged ship. And over time, very definitely so. And I was going to actually ask Louis this question. The cog did not disappear. There's still a cog around. Nicholas Witsen in 1671 describes one. It's a smaller vessel. It has some similarities to its medieval predecessor. But yeah, these things hang on locally or regionally. It's especially over long distance trades and high volume, high bulk, and bulk trades, where full rig ships survive and thrive. Yes, I think that it's actually the Arabian Sea where you get some real melding of shipbuilding technology in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. Galleys were certainly used, and Portuguese full-rigged ships were used. Portuguese full-rigged ships were imitated to some degree more recently than in the 17th century. Portuguese sailors were impressed by the character, nature, and speed of the ships built by Arab shipbuilders when they got to in the Indian Ocean in the early 16th century. And and the East India Company's not alone. Europeans, Portuguese, but certainly Dutch, English shippers used vessels of local construction. Even on occasion, the East India Company used Chinese junks to ship between the Pearl River and what was then Batavia. So yeah, there was melding, and there was using of local designs, again, especially in smaller vessels, because they were known, they could be built there, the talent existed, the supplies existed, it was a well-established tradition, so went ahead and did it. As to the use of shipboard artillery, yeah, there's lots of reasons to improve artillery.
Where does it fit in the model? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, okay. The first illustration of shipboard artillery is on a sailing ship. Is English, and it's from the 1490s. But it's very deep in the waist. You cannot really use these things. I mean, it takes an hour to reload them because they blow up, and even after you reload them, they may blow up when you try to fire them. They're very heavy, which means that stability is a problem. So the total number of guns is low, and there tend to be light guns. But in the late 16th century, the artillery becomes lighter. Now there's a general desire for that, but it's an especially pressing one for warships. And so by the time of the Sovereign of the Seas, which I showed you from 1637, yeah, these are very light guns, and they're highly reliable. And governments promote that. They push for that because they want to put them on warships, which are full-rigged vessels.
So in the model, is it a spillover effect?
Yeah, it is. None of these spillovers, of course, are entirely, no technical change it comes in isolation. So there are various forces involved. But the argument, thank you, the argument is that you can't ignore these big things, like printing in the 17th and 18th, 16th, 17th, and 18th century. You can't ignore transistors, which are in all these gadgets that are sitting in front of us. They have spillover effects, and they have a large impact on society in various ways. And that's the sailing ship. That's the argument, is that that's the sailing ship in the period we're discussing.
Thank you. We have one question for Yulia, Goran Ryden.
It's rather a comment, or a few comments actually, to what I think was a really fascinating story, and I'd like to hear more about that. in due course. The first point I was going to make is that you do have a bit of research on these issues, and I would say that kind of the German angle is more important than the British angle, but there's a British writer who's written about it, Paul Ward, which is a guy you should read because he's got one article called, I think it's called The Birth of Sustainability, or something similar to that. And Ward, together with the Swedish scholar Sverker Solin, has written about the historical, they've written about things that you talked about as well, which so check these out. And another point is also related to Dutch, because sustainability, which we think is a very, very contemporary word, in German, Nachhaltigkeit was actually invented in the 18th century. So you do have a sustainability discussion actually using the same word, but you have it in Germany. And you mostly have it in relation to forestry, not agriculture in the German context. And in my own research, I see that as well. I mean, when it comes to forestry is so important in this discussion, because you can fail in agriculture 1 year, then it's a disaster. But if you fail in forestry, which have a kind of regrowing time, not 1 year, but actually 25 years. So the kind of sustainability discussion is very, very clear in 18th century Swedish iron making, which is based on charcoal resources. The interesting stuff, which is one that kind of connects back to your first graph when you talked about discussion about sustainability. Now we talk about social sustainability or kind of ecological sustainability. And the interesting stuff with the Swedish writers and the Swedish praxis, which I'm dealing with, is actually that there is an extreme ecological awareness of ecological sustainability. The trees are important, but there's nothing about social sustainability, because people are not important, because they are just peasants or workers. So I'd love to hear more about that, but I mean the German connection I would love to have that actually, and I'm sure that these writers deal with forestry as well. More trees. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your comments. Very, very interesting. I also made a constatation that, for example, the last two French authors were probably influenced by German agronomist authors like Albrecht Thayer, notably. It will be very, very interesting, yes, to see the link between French literature and the German one. I am agree with you that there are mostly ecological issues on sustainability, but for example in the Olivier de Serres work we see clearly also social preoccupation, because he was speaking more of good father management, of care for humans, even for servants who live on the farm. So we can also see some premises for social preoccupation in agricultural accounting, and it's very passionate. Thank you very much.
You would join me in thanking our two panelists for the session this afternoon. I'd like to invite the members of the round table to come up to the front of the room and take their place. You don't have to go anywhere.
Do we have to leave? Yeah.
Oh. Sorry.
Per trovare il...
He's first.
Come devo fare? Cominciate bene.
Is it which one?
No, no, no.
Okay. E? You see?
Sì.
Okay. Okay. Welcome. We are starting the round table. Each of the participants will speak for about 10 minutes on a subject of their choosing. These are not pre-circulated. Our first speaker is Carlos Aldenia Cobera, who from the University of Zaragoza. Carlos.
Thanks. Quando presentai al Comitato Scientifico la proposta dell'economia della conoscenza come tema per la XV-XVIII settimana, non pensavo
When I submitted the proposal to the committee, I thought it was accepting, but there was an important aspect of the current economic theory, and its validity was not taken into account so far. The agreement has been great in my proposal during this week. This is showing that I was a bit wrong, and my idea was pretty well accepted by other researchers. I tried to explain my arguments in the prolusion of last Sunday, and I think it's not going to be a repetition. I tried to make a summary of the presentations delivered. I'm obliged to show you to some examples the mistake made by the economists, saying that what makes a difference between modern era in the two last centuries of the previous millennium is learning, apprenticeship. That's another way of saying knowledge. A few years ago, I devoted my time to archaeology, and I always like these objects. Historians are not considering this, despite this is very important. I mean ceramic. For millennia, ceramic has been essential in domestic life, as we know, and its production underwent major cultural and technological changes. And that's very important and obvious. And also fabrics, ceramic, as differentiated ways of production. This can be judged as luxury goods or affordable goods. But its consumption is local and international. The demand is connected with the effects of faction, with some cultural background. So having a piece enamel didn't make it possible to examine the physical chemical processes of manufacturing. That's why the knowledge transfer for making ceramic should be done with other means. A large consumption goods or asset, which is not mentioned in the general summary of technological development. My objective is the one of showing in a very quick way that the production of ceramic in Europe go through three main manufacturing steps. Useful knowledge necessary for its production, with some later accumulation, paving the way to more and more performing results with a higher productivity level. So we can say, without this accumulation in the 19th century on these grounds, there would be impossible, these developments. Before this spread of these ceramic manufacturing techniques, this is the 13th century in the entire Mediterranean area, between 1300 and 1350, the technical solution to enable ceramics, known by many centers in the Muslim world, they were moved to other Christian areas in such a way that in 30 years, ceramic was made of this kind in Marseille, Barcelona, Valencia, Pisa, and Genoa. So in summary, ceramic, table ceramics or tableware were made with the double baking, the first to make the piece and the second for the decoration. This was done through the use of enamel, and just a solution of XIIth lead for vitrification. That gives to this type of ceramic, the green and brown ceramic. This was key because this was shown in the decorations. The result was product accessible and quite eye-catching. Two qualities, making this easy to be marketed, belonging to the chapter of the luxury of the poor. Entire cities and towns, they started their activities in making huge quantities of these ceramic products. And also they introduced the color blue, and they took the way towards some higher technical sophistication. Anyhow, this kind of ceramic, large consumption ceramics, were made till the modern age. And in many centers in Italy, with the name of Majolica, in Orvieto and Faenza, and many other urban places like Montelupo, near Florence, where the production was very special, like the industrial production. It's important to stress that in northern part of Europe, we produce enameled ceramics with some glass coating, so you could see the color of the bottom of the hull. Up to the 16th century, the pot makers didn't get the necessary knowledge to make ceramics enameled, showing difficulties of knowledge transfer. So in the 14th century, the Muslim workshops of Granada, they perfected this formula to produce ceramica almost gilded, with some golden reflection for the chemical compounds contained, with the third baking in such a way to get very shining pieces with combination of gold, blue on a white background. At the end of the century, the artisans from Valencia were just capable of making pieces of this quality, high quality. And they were just capable of occupying or entering the European market. So the appearance of these technical process made the separation between high segment and low segment ceramic. So there was just a split of the price, according to the technical cultural background. Even though we knew colors in a wide catalogs of shapes and decorations, the evolution of ceramics, name from Malaga, independently from the place where they were made, these started the beginning of the second explosion of technical creativity and cultural creativity, to which I made reference in my presentation. These Iberian hegemony broke down in the second half of the 15th century when Majolica's Italian were better from the technical viewpoint to be very present in the European market as to luxury goods. According to these discoveries for the preparation of colors, pigments, but also as to the baking system, Majolicas of the Renaissance took an expressive language, very rich for the complexity of their abstract decoration, but also for the illustration and representation typical of the paintings of that period. This success of the ceramics can be measured also with the multiplier of the production centers. Each of them specialized in new ways, shapes, colors, and new decorations, and for their exportation to Europe and the Americas. The Faenza ceramics, that's an important example, with this name also kept in French and in English. Many pieces been kept, just authentic masterpieces. Their price was very high, and they are just contained in the catalogs of the princely assets. But what's interesting for these ceramics, that their value was not so considerable or high as the one of other precious objects or items, and the demand was not limited to the upper classes. This displays the huge development of this production, industrial production, a huge quantity of places interested in the Italian peninsula. And also in the second half of the 16th century, the circulation of artisans was enough and wide. So the technical knowledge was not a secret. And so other manufacturing centers were capable of getting this knowledge. In this same period of time, porcelain China goods arrived to Europe in large quantities from the Portuguese factories, from the Portuguese colonies, through Manila and America. These were China goods, very, very beautiful, very well appreciated by centuries now, and their presence in the market provoked the third big revolution I was making reference a while before. It's not only buying huge quantities of China goods. Europeans asked the Chinese artisans in the 17th century to copy the styles and models, Dutch ones, Venetian and French models, and finally to adopt decorations to the Western taste with heraldic or a coat of arms carved on. But the amount of China goods pushed in this ordinary European competition in order to reproduce them with the native materials. And these up until the 19th century. But we didn't get the same value of the same beauty of the Chinese goods. This was a drop. This was a flop. This was a failure, because after the state inspiration, there was a third step or phase of innovation with the disappearance of Lisbon and Talavera ceramics, to mention the most known as Sèvres, and other ceramics almost disappeared after the China goods. As an example, and to conclude now, I will speak of this phase of the Alcora fabric established in 1727 with a great deal of intelligence. Garandra was the manager, the most important exponent of the Spanish monarchy of the Enlightenment. So this pushed Spanish industrialization, and they made the China goods, Iberian goods for the Americas. The average production from Algora is around 200,000 pieces, with the maximum between 1752 and 1763. Years where they made 4 million pieces. In the establishments, there were more than 300 workers, and one part being apprentices. 6 furnaces to bake pieces during manufacturing. They added on some additional furnaces for the so-called clay products, a sort of English clay, and also for soft porcelain, which was a real variant, not a real porcelain. But they failed in getting real porcelain, but not for lack of initiatives, because they hire French and Spanish experts in order to apply the real chemical formulas whenever possible, just to get rid of some shortage of materials. In spite of these, Algora ceramic is good for quality and riches of decorations. In line with European factories, 1800, with the disappearance of the American Empire. So this walk through the medieval history of ceramic is showing clearly that during these centuries we had a great deal of useful knowledge about the properties of clays, chemical compounds of decorations, and effects of heat, thanks to which experimentation where possible. The circulation of this knowledge paved the way to a form of hybridation, European porcelain or imitation porcelain, or the Chinese goods with Western decoration. The passage of this knowledge includes all possibilities, the knowledge from the masters to the apprentices, and also spikes, espionage, in order to increase these prestigious productions. It's important to stress the notion of prestige, because the raw materials, about a few exceptions, were not so expensive. And what made ceramic expensive was the work of painters. However, just a few exclusive prices or whatever, they were real luxury objects. Most of the production were just oriented towards markets of a certain purchasing power, where there was a strong demand of social distinction. Ceramic belongs to the development of a large consumption society with silk, fabrics, cotton, tea, or chocolate bars. So ceramic added to respect the fashion laws. This explains the huge proliferation of different ways and forms of these items, objects. So the catalogue of Algora ceramics, 1750, showed 300 different styles and models. And in the rest of European industry, the same happened starting from the 17th century. Technical knowledge, demand, and a strong market in the first step of globalization gave a stimulus to the growth of productivity that we should study even furthermore, case by case, manufacturing center by manufacturing center. And this has not been done yet, because ceramic is usually studied by art historians. But in all the development steps I've been pointing out, we got specialty processes, optimization of labor, scale economy, standardization also was possible, also in very wide repertoire. So it seems like to me that it's undoubtful that productivity increase, and also we got the mass production. We have to examine other factors, difference in quality, and the management of these productions by guilds. Also, in function of the marketplace they wanted to enter. But I want to insist on this point, that the great development of the modern and medieval ceramic industry would be impossible without a very high technical skills within the framework of the knowledge economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. Markus Denzel, University of Leipzig.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues and friends, it is a very great honor and pleasure for me to speak at this round table and to such a group of excellent scholars who have been experts in the topic of our Settimana long before I began to engage in this field of research. So I only can try to deliver insight in some of my impressions I have got during this very inspiring Settimana. But it would not be possible to summarize all the well-prepared and ingenious papers presented to us in the last 3.5 days. First of all, let me stress that from my point of view, it was an excellent Settimana with such a broad variety of aspects of knowledge economy in pre- and early industrial times, whereby the term knowledge economy can be defined, according to Joel Mokyr, as one that produces sufficient useful knowledge to generate a process of modern economic growth. It has been our aim to reflect on how knowledge facilitated economic growth before 1750 to 1820 by the improvement of productivity and by resilience of European medieval and modern societies after subsequent demographic, economic and war crises. In preparation of the Settimana, we identified 3 key terms: useful knowledge, innovation and productivity. In the last years, scholars have pointed to the substantial transformations that occurred in useful knowledge in the late medieval and early modern period, but in assessing the impact of these transformations on economic growth, they have tended to highlight institutional and social contexts more strongly than technological innovations. It was the aim of our Settimana to, let me say, modify this a little bit and to shift the focus to the economic aspects, at least to the same degree as recent research has emphasized cultural ones. From my point of view, this is a very important thought because we dealt with economic knowledge. So I would like to point out that we should speak about useful economic knowledge or economically useful knowledge, not only simple about useful knowledge. Most of the knowledge compiled by mankind was useful, I guess, but was it economically useful as well? This differentiation is very important from my point of view, and especially for the appraisal of the results of our conference. We heard only one contribution concerning the economic knowledge on agriculture, peasantry, and all features of rural economy, which covered up to 90% of the pre-industrial economic output and which was, in the scope of the so-called agricultural revolution, the most discussed and described economic field, at least in 18th century England, perhaps in France, and the Holy Roman Empire as well. Most of the pre-industrial technical skills constituted a fine background for innovations in crafts and industry since the Middle Ages, and in the commercial activities, the elaborate techniques of bookkeeping and costing became more and more essential instruments for crisis and resilience management of commercial and later industrial enterprises. So I think that we as economic historians should concentrate more on these economic factors than on the cultural ones. If we ask for the best basic parameters of economic growth, economic factors are decisive, and cultural factors take only the second or an even lower rank. After these preliminary remarks, dear colleagues and friends, allow me to give some 4 impressions of our 53rd Settimana. First of all, I'm impressed by the variety of sources we heard about, from the craftsman's text to the tally's text and price competition and so on. These sources give us excellent information in theory and practice, and bring the material culture close to the classic economic history. And I think this can and will enrich our further research. Second point. I was also very impressed by the contribution of Bert, sitting here at the table, who emphasized the reputation of craftsmen, that the reputation of craftsmen went down when information on their crafts were published in a broader manner, and this made me pensive. His finding is correct, of course. And when I think about the situation, the Holy Roman Empire in early modern times, it is quite the same. But in a longer perspective, and when we look at merchants and businessmen, it is the other way around. The reputation of merchants and businessmen in society was strengthened as information on their profession was published in the merchants' handbooks of the 16th and 17th centuries and the famous encyclopedias of the 18th century. From the point of this question of research, I would like to suggest that we should widen our perspective for this question into the 19th century, because in the wake of the industrialization, many new institutions of practical education were founded. For example, in Germany, the Gewerbeschulen up to the technical universities. The German lands and later the German Empire were leading in the latter sector, followed by Austria, the United States and Switzerland, and so on. And the graduates of these institutions have enjoyed a very high reputation by their societies. And so I think this modifies the argument we have discussed a little bit in the long term. Third point. This morning's papers confirmed Joel Mockyer's statement that technological creativity blossomed in 15th century and 16th century Europe. The useful knowledge we've heard about, be it financial, technological, or about markets, could contribute to a higher productivity and, in the last consequence, to economic growth. This became obviously clear in the outstanding speech of Richard Unger, who linked closely progress in naval technology over centuries to global economic growth, concluding the shipping sector offered sources of growth and resilience of the economy. My fourth and last point. Although one might assume that the variety of themes presented in our conference has been too broad, I would not agree. Only this wide spectrum of detailed insights in production, commerce, finance, and agriculture gives us the possibility to answer the question we expressed in our call for papers, at least partly. It is neither the time nor the place to answer all these questions here in detail, but I think that we can state that economically useful knowledge could induce innovations which further deepened and widened this economically useful knowledge. And this cycle was at least one of the decisive factors of raising profitability and, as a final consequence of economic growth, becoming obvious in the industrial evolutions in different European and later also non-European countries. To say it more clearly, innovations did influence economic growth. Cultural and institutional processes which generated knowledge and human capital could influence the development of labor productivity. Knowledge did contribute to reduce risks in pre-industrial societies through information, communication, and resilience. But one question remains open. To what extent was the culture of growth, which Joel Mockyer has postulated for the early modern European economy, based on a specific European knowledge economy? And this question, dear colleagues and friends, could be the starting point for our final discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Markus. Our next speaker is Richard Unger, University of British Columbia, Canada.
Thank you. And let me do and imitate and agree with colleague Denzel on a number of points. And let me start with Joel Mokyr. And I'm afraid I haven't read his latest, but I'm assuming, from what I've heard in the last few days, is that his latest, even more than before, underplay the importance of the practical, the market, in the implementation of technologies. And we have, I think, shown that that's the wrong direction, which is what indeed was one of the purposes of this meeting. From Mokyr, and in general, we heard and hear a lot about useful knowledge, and I know from attempts to learn languages other than the one my mother taught me, that a good way of learning language is to ask what the opposite is. Then you learn two words at the same time. So let me ask you the question of, is there any useless knowledge? Well, yeah, there is. But what makes it useless, and what makes useful knowledge useful? And for that, one needs to know much more about the circumstances. Well, to reflect a bit on, in general, what we've done over the last few days, we've looked at a number of case studies, and from that built up knowledge about technical change. And we've looked at overviews, and both talking about specific inventions. And I think you have to do both. When history of technology became widely practiced, at least in North America, as distinctions were typically made between invention and innovation, and between technical and technological change. And we've lost those distinctions. That's not necessarily bad, but we should also at the same time not lose sight of that separation, which drives this distinction between novelty, that what is in fact new, what is a new idea, what is new knowledge, and the imitation or implementation of things that are different. It is perhaps proper that I should mention in a Renaissance Italian town the influence the Renaissance has made on our whole understanding of the world at large, but specifically technology. There's this idea of creation. It's an idea promoted by Vasari and defended by and promoted by art historians still to this day, that there is this individual who somehow creates something different. We now know from looking at a number of case studies that it's not just the creative person or spirit needed to invent something. It takes circumstances. The extreme case that disproves the uniqueness of genius is I admit it's a 19th century example, but it's the simultaneous invention of the smelting of aluminum, which was done in the United States and done in France almost in the same week by two men who had never heard anything about each other and didn't know anything about them, which does say that the context does count. We also know that new technologies appear and some people refuse to accept them for various reasons. We also have people who adopt new ideas, sometimes to their sorrow because they find out they don't work, but also late adopters, people who hang around for a long time and then finally get a cell phone. I'm guilty of that. So there's a large picture in the Mokyr spirit, but it's not what generates the specific technical change and their diffusion in what we see. Sources of invention come through big breakthroughs or from the work of craftsmen. It's not one or the other, it's both. Smith assumed that workers are simultaneously lazy and competitive, which makes them inventive, but automatically. And it's, I think it's probably true in our own experience. It's a lot faster to write a paper that has an extreme and odd and strange theory than to slog through piles of data just to generate a case. There are big ideas, and there are not so big ideas, and lesser ideas or practices. So I think what we need to do and are doing is working backward from the specific inventions, but always in the context of an understanding of nature. So theology counts. We need to know about Aristotle, or maybe Plato, or even Hesiod. We traditionally went from big to small, but small to large might well lead us to the big breakthroughs. And if that's the case, then the thinking of Aristotelians in the 13th century, most prominently Thomas Aquinas in promoting exemplarism, which then in turn leads to the collection of data and the sorting of data, the creation of categories, and learning about nature, is a source, a necessary source for technological change. At the same time, the idea that the Middle Ages discounted and ignored technology is, I think, wrong, in a word. And I can give you one obvious example, and that's Hugh of St. Victor in the 1130s, living in what is now Paris, in his Didascalicon. He talked about the arts, the quadrivium and the trivium, and then he added a list of mechanical arts, something at the same level, but different and deserving of recognition. So while, I don't know, woodworking may not quite be as important as geometry, but certainly worthy of praise in the Middle Ages. And it's not then that the monastic religious culture ignored technicians and their work, or that I think we should lessen the insistence on some break in the 15th and 16th century, and the idea that suddenly in the 16th and 17th century there was a sudden breakthrough in creative invention, that it had its origins in the Middle Ages, and which continued and became and increased in pace and still seems to be increasing. Knowledge transfer is something that's permeated much of our discussion. That is knowledge and not technology transfer. For technology transfer, you need more than just knowledge, and that appears repeatedly. And that's why things like the role of government attracts us. Questions of geography, country versus city, for example, organizations, guilds, for example. And with governments, the role of government, imposing the same rules over a wider area. But that does raise the question of how effective early modern governments were in imposing those rules. There has historically, I should say not historically, there has been since the middle of the 19th century, and efforts by nationalist historians to certify the character of the emerging nation states, a sense that states were powerful institutions in the Middle Ages and early modern period, but we know from local studies that, well, that's certainly questionable. Hence, that means we need to be skeptical about the documentation that those governments produced. We shouldn't be, by the way, we shouldn't be impressed by the establishment and extension of territorial states in Northern and Western Europe from 1400 on, because they weren't that revolutionary, and they really were modeled on the Italian city-state, which did some of the same things to promote technology transfer that we notice later. It might be true that transfer is not the word we're looking for, or the idea we're looking for, that really what we're interested in is adoption or adaptation. That is, if something is found out somewhere, it might not just fit with what you know, making the knowledge useless, or require some adaptation. By the way, if there's technology transfer, that means the technology already exists. It's not original by definition. So with transfer, we're dealing with different questions. I guess we're going back to the distinction, that old distinction between invention and innovation. which means we're going back to asking things like, what are market conditions? What are social and cultural conditions? I can tell you this, I can guarantee it, that new technologies will be slow to be adopted if they're not like the old ones. Things have to look like what they're replacing. The extreme case is books. Those books with fat pages that were the first things that came out of presses in the 15th and 16th centuries were done, and you couldn't tell the difference between them and manuscript books in the early days. But slowly they established their own character and knowledge. Would they have moved on? I mean, would Tesla cars been sold if they didn't look like gasoline-powered cars? I think not. One thing I might add, which has been inherent in what we've talked about, and that's the importance of standardization. I think we've understated its importance. The business about the craftsman becoming an automaton that we used to look on as a bad thing about industrialization. But we're not just talking about the jacquard loom, for example. My favorite example, and one I have had no success in convincing anyone of, but let me try this on you. 4 guys walk into a room. Each one is carrying a box. 2 small boxes, 1 slightly larger box, and an even bigger box. Each one has strings, and they carry a bow. And this guy, let's call him Mozart, comes walking into the room, puts pieces of paper in front of them with black splotches on them. And one of the guys with the smallest box says 1, 2, 3, 4, and they play a string quartet. They've never seen each other before, never met at any time in the past. And by the way, it's pretty good stuff, and people like it. Now, that can only happen through standardization, which musical notation begins in the 11th century, 10th, 11th centuries. It takes some time for that to be standardized, but I think that's one of the processes that we've been noticing. And again, to go back to books, they became standardized. That shows up in the size of their size and in catalogs, which describe an easily understood commodity. This business of instructions and categories, in other words, the basis for this kind of standardization, does go back to cookbooks, which had many different variants and greater or lesser precision. But those how-to books, those written works, set out to do, and indeed succeeded in, slowly moving toward standardization. It's a product of technical change, the standardization. It's also a way to transfer knowledge and technology, and the more standard, the easier. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Our last speaker is Bert De Munck, University of Antwerp.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. It's an honor to be in this line. Perhaps being the last speaker is perhaps not a gift, especially because I might have I have some general remarks which might be perceived in the end as useless knowledge rather than useful knowledge, but let's see how that develops. I have a kind of a meta-reflection actually, which starts as my colleagues, which starts from the overwhelming amount of insights and views and data we have received the last few days. The scope and the richness of what we have doing is, I think, impressive. It was supposed to be about useful knowledge, and now I hear already that the idea that we have gone far broader. It was supposed about the relationship of useful knowledge with economic development, And indeed, we discussed an extremely wide range of issues related to that question. We discussed institutions, from universities over guilds and apprenticeship, to states and taxes and privileges, societies organizing prices, etc. We discussed indeed also cultural elements, writing and numerical skills, different attitudes toward nature, references to the common good, etc. We discussed political elements, warfare, politics, community building, the role of the state, the state's administration, and the relationship with bookkeeping. And what was perhaps most remarkable, we discussed a great deal of material elements. Obviously, we discussed the materiality of economic production, technology, forges, pulleys, watermills, grinders, and so forth, but also the materiality of products, cannons, and earthenware, among other things. And then there was, of course, the materiality of things in which useful knowledge is stored and travels. Books, drawings, tally sticks, accounting books, manuscripts with book types and prices, which is itself related again to other material processes like papermaking, for instance. And last but not least, perhaps we discussed also the materiality of the bodies in which knowledge travels as well, the bodies of artisans which physically meet in workshops and so forth. And if that is not enough, a lot of these things seems to be extremely entangled. Instruction books and catalogs are entangled with heraldic culture, accounting manuals with schools, bookkeeping with monies of account, tax collection books with politics, the materiality of state formation, sales to warfare, and so on and so forth. So this is, in my view, history as it should be in a way, rich, complex, detailed. It involves a lot of thick description. And one idea could have been, for me, to expand this and to start making additional connections between the papers, and then we could perhaps be here for another 3 days and find more connections, more context, more entanglements, more potential relationships, and so on. But luckily for you, I did something different. I hope so, luckily for you. I'm going to take another route and develop general remarks related to that. And my remark starts actually from the observation that there is a certain ambivalence here, because there are also mechanisms at work, in our work, which actually prevent us from finding more connections and more complexity. And this is, I think, because we are looking for causalities. We are looking for causal factors, the relationship between useful knowledge and economic growth, of useful economic knowledge and economic growth, for instance. We are all eager to be social scientists who do not only describe, but explain as well. So we look for, not only for connections or additional complexity, but we look for causal relationship. The relationship between demographic patterns and proto-industry also, for instance. So we ask how economic growth or economic development or innovation is driven by or caused by Hindu or Arabic numerals, double entry bookkeeping, manuals, apprenticeship, the state, migration, etc. And then it becomes a bit more difficult, and we might run into trouble, in my view, because for that we have to create analytical lenses, categories, useful knowledge as opposed to non-useful or useless knowledge. And we have to distinguish between causes and effects, or between explananda and explanantia. In short, we have to reduce the complexity and make decisions which should perhaps be better avoided. Did technology produce economic growth, or was it vice versa? Did the development of certain types of knowledge create certain types of books, or was it the other way around? Did the market create catalogs to benchmark prices, or did these manuscripts and related practices create integrated markets? Did double entry bookkeeping drive economic growth, or was it the other way around? And so on and so forth. For me, this ambivalence brings to mind a lesson that I have learned from the famous, somewhat controversial perhaps, sociologist of science, Bruno Latour. Latour argued, among other things, that our tendency to distinguish cause from effect and to identify specific causal factors, that tendency is profoundly modern. It is our modern way of doing science. And of course, our modern way of looking does not only force us to distinguish causal factors from things to be explained, but we also do so inevitably with specific theoretical and conceptual frameworks in mind, useful knowledge in this case. But how to decide, for instance, whether something is due to sustainability thinking, as we heard in the last session, or rather the need to use natural resources in an efficient way? And I think most of us are aware of the problem and would agree that we need to be reflexive about our approaches and the lenses we are using. But I think it is particularly difficult and important for this workshop because the concept of useful knowledge almost forces us to instrumentalize things. From the vantage point of useful knowledge, a lot of the instruments we have been discussing almost automatically turn into solutions to economic or technical problems. We tend to frame double entry bookkeeping manuals and manuscripts or specific technologies or Arabic numbers or apprenticeship and so on. We tend to see them as solutions to economic challenges, to a lack of efficiency, for instance, or we see them as answers to the need of a modern state, the needs of a modern state, when it comes to the need to efficiently collect and manage taxes, for instance, or produce weapons in a context of war, or to exploit minerals, etc., etc. But the problems we start from are, to an extent, of course, always projections of scholars who have grown up in a modern economy and in a modern state context. It's mostly our problems, but perhaps not the problems of the historical actors we study, have experienced them. And the more you go back in time, of course, the more difficult it becomes to match these two perspectives. So this explains, I think, why we often fail to see that at least some of the causal relationships might just as well be reversed sometimes. And I could repeat all the examples already given, but I will limit myself to one example which is close to my own work, and that didn't come up the last 3 days, not coincidentally, I think, because we were invited in this workshop to examine the impact of useful knowledge production on economic developments, while Marxist historians in the past, in the 20th century, Marxist historians and sociologists of science have actually argued that economic and technological processes had an impact on the production of knowledge, even up to the epistemological level. Edgar Zilsel, to name only one, specifically argued that the economic and technical practices of artisans are at the very basis of the scientific revolution. And I think we could add examples to this. Also, based on the case studies we have heard the last 3 days, I think we could often reflect on what causal relationships should actually be favored or not. So, my point is that our attempts to have a problem-solving approach and the incentives to address the overall question as social scientists would, these attempts have a kind of a price. The trouble with it is that we are actually reducing the complexity and the richness and the layeredness of history, and that we are in danger of producing, of course, teleological narratives. And I just wonder, I don't think that I have a solution to it, or that I can claim to do better, but I just wonder whether this is the best thing to do. Wouldn't it be better to add to the complexity, to add more layers, more factors, more elements? Wouldn't it be better to indeed stay for an additional 3 days, enjoy Italy, and find additional entanglements? For starters, that could help, for instance, to see yet more spillover effects between different sectors or between different media, to see more crossover developments, cross-fertilization between different contexts. Or it would perhaps help to appreciate more unintended consequences, which are also important, I think, in technological developments or choices made in that context, or to include historical coincidences, historical accidents, appreciate that historical actors are bricolaging, failing, that it's all about trial and error, and take into account perhaps also factors like religion, and so on and so forth. And I am myself very much more and more influenced by actor network theory, which is actually basically an attempt to get rid of the architectural way of thinking in which you always have to look to identify the underlying and the more basic structural causal factors, which then explain the effects you see thereof. That's actor network theory is actually an attempt to go beyond that. And Bruno Latour, who is the most famous of these scholars, they have replaced this actually with a call to simply look at the networks, the connections, the entanglement, to look at how all these different elements connect and are connected. And importantly, in actor network theory, these networks include very often, very much, material elements, or non-human elements, as they call it. And actually, the whole range of elements we have discussed the last days are part of the networks to be examined and on an equal footing, without making a hierarchy up front between, for instance, material factors, economic factors, cultural factors, political factors, and so on. There is no a priori hierarchy in these factors. The question how they are all connected exactly and how they become connected over time is precisely what is to be examined from this perspective. So it's an invitation actually to reconstruct the networks and the entanglements, to follow the networks back in time, and to look for the networks behind the networks which we already see and are already aware of and are familiar with. So it really invites to add to the complexity, to add more elements and layers to our narratives, to add more historical context, you could say. And some of you might think that, and perhaps rightly so, that this would be old-fashioned, that it would be a step backwards because we would turn to mere description again in a way. You would describe more in a more detailed way what is happening. And this is actually how I have thought about it myself for a long time. But I'm no longer sure. And to express my uncertainty, I would like to end with a quote from Bruno Latour to take home with you, perhaps to discuss now. That's also a possibility. It's just simply a quote to reflect upon. It's not a judgment on the papers, to be sure, because I have enjoyed the papers very much. I have learned a lot, but it's just something I think to reflect upon. It's from the book Reassembling the Social of Bruno Latour, and the quote goes like this: "If a description remains in need of an explanation, it means that it is still a bad description." And that's the end of the quote and the end of my, my presentation.
Thank you. So we have time for questions now, perhaps to encourage a more organic conversation. We will not be filling these out. I'm just going to ask for volunteers to come up, but you will need to speak in the microphone. Yes, please. Goran.
It's rather a comment, but I think it's kind of related to what Bert was talking about. And I'm going to quote as well. That's why I have my computer with me. I mean, I think my comment, which is a critical one, is in line with articles like proto-industrialization, one concept too many. I recently went to a lecture on capitalism, a concept too big to fail. Love those two titles. And so I think useful knowledge that Moquir has coined, and I think it is a kind of straitjacket to us, and in that sense, I'm very much in favor of what Bert says. Because what does it mean? And I think the biggest problem with it is that we are using it as a kind of trans-historical concept. And it's a trans-historical concept that we perhaps might not, which might not be a useful concept for us. Useful knowledge is a useless concept for historians in my way. And I think that to quote again, and I'm going to do a double quoting here, and I'm going to quote the great economic historian Sheila Ogilvie, but I'm going to quote Alexander Pope behind her words, because she wrote a brilliant article a couple of years ago that was called "Whatever is Right," and she was then talking about institutions, and it is by that and with the Pope quote is that everything that is in line with our argument is actually also right. So useful knowledge is the thing that kind of produce the overall story that we like to tell, and which I'm telling as well. So it's not a critique of the papers. It's a critique of how we do this kind of history, and when and I'm going to come with a kind of another definition of useful knowledge, because when Moquir was coining the concept, I spent quite a lot of time of reading Daniel Defoe, and I'm going to quote Daniel Defoe from 1725 or 6 or something like that, and it is in the book that is called Discoveries and Improvements, and he wrote, "In this important search, we shall necessarily observe how these discoveries have naturally tended to the improvement of mankind in all the parts of useful knowledge, and the tendency an increase of knowledge has to the increasing the felicity of man's life." But if you look at Defoe, because in one way you can actually read this as exactly what Moquir is on about. But the interesting stuff with Defoe is that he was writing in a completely different time, because he actually used improvements and innovation in exactly the same way as discoveries. So innovation was actually to discover what was in nature. And Defoe was writing in a time when God had created the world, that there was no possibility of changing it, apart from increasing knowledge about the world in which you lived. So when we talk about technological change, when we talk about innovation, we talk about something that is man-made. Defoe doesn't think of anything that is man-made. He always stresses it's God-made. And actually, it was actually the genius, the man as a genius was something that God has created as well. And it was the genius that could actually discover things in Earth. And the thing with him, which is kind of contrast him from Moquir, is that he's actually using useful knowledge as a historical concept, because he lived in a period when history was seen in a different way. And Moquir is using it as a trans-historical concept. And that is a big, big, big distinction. And we can use Defoe's ideas about useful knowledge But we can only use it for the early modern period, I would say, because at the end of the 18th century, we have a development that moves us into a different way of seeing historical change and actually chronology and time. So I think we have to be extremely cautious when we use useful knowledge, and we have to, in relation to what Bert said as well, we have to actually try to understand what is meant by that in the 15th century or in the present day, etc., etc. So I think it is, whatever is right. and we shouldn't fall in the trap that Alexander Pope actually reminded us about in the 18th century. Thanks.
Does anybody on the panel want to comment on that? No?
Yeah.
Yes, Bert.
Perhaps briefly, I would distinguish. I follow the comment of Joran, but I think the concept is unproblematic insofar as when it describes the development of a certain type of knowledge which you could call useful in history. So as long as it is a descriptive concept, but it changes, of course, and it turns into something more dangerous as soon as you're going to lose it as as soon as you use it as an analytical category, which starts to explain other development. That's, I think, the difference, and that's the real trap, I think, in using the concept.
Salvatore?
Yes, about the useful knowledge, I think we had really two different interpretations. Yesterday, Renato Sabatini told, okay, useful knowledge, the other knowledge is not so useful, so it just was against the idea of the knowledge just directed to provoke or to give more economic progress and so on. He just wanted to underline the problem. There is another kind of knowledge. Today, Denzel was not so satisfied by the results of the Congress because we talk too much about institutions, social, and so on. In my opinion, you are wrong. Because for me, there was another aspect of the useful knowledge. It was the effect exposition effect. That means this idea of knowledge sometimes is improved in some areas, economic development. In other areas, there is no economic development. So my question is, Zuckerberg, was possible to operate in Italy, or it was really so imbricated in American scenario, American society? So we have a really different answer also to economic analysis and so on. Okay, it's not our task. We are here for the problem of economic development. But if you talk about a general historian, and I feel general historian more or a part of economic historian, if you talk about these people, they are looking also the political results and so on and so on. So there is an answer which is an open plane to analyze what kind of answer we have to some useful knowledge about this technical knowledge. Just the beginning to our analysis.
No? You want to say anything? No? Okay. Would anyone else like to make a comment? Please come forward. Well, everybody is silent. Eric, would you like to come up and complete the meeting? Eric Ertz? However, well, before that happens, let me thank the four members of the roundtable for a very stimulating set of presentations. Please join me.
Autorità.
Authorities, dear colleagues, dear friends, following the round table, we have come to the end of the conference. The time has come for us, a sad moment, because we have to finish the scientific activity, and we are closing. We have the official closure of our week. This year's week, 53rd week throughout Istituto Datini. I'd like to take one more second, and I would like to take the opportunity to thank some people. First of all, our authors, of course. Without their presentations, I would like to thank our speakers, because without their participation and their involvement into the discussion, we wouldn't have had such a week. But I also would like to thank all the people taking the floor and participating in the debate, and the colleagues participating, the four musketeers participating to the round table, or attending the round table. And then my colleagues from the scientific committee and the Junta, the Executive Council, and more in particular, Markus Denzel and Carlos Laliena, because a few years ago they suggested the main topic, the fascinating subject of this week. And then, and it is very, very important really, I would like to express my deepest thanks and gratitude to all those contributing to the success of the week, working very, very hard, sometimes and mostly in the shadow, invisible, but they have always been present all day long. For example, our interpreters, thank you very much, because our interpreters understood the content of our text better than us. I don't think so. I don't think so. Then 1, 2, 3, and 4. Technical staff, the people from the technical staff, with the technical service, with PCs, cameras, microphone, so the technical staff. And so finally, I wish to thank the core of Istituto Datini. I would like to thank the beating heart of Istituto Datini, the three ladies, the three girls of the administrative staff, Federica, Laura, and Letizia. Shall we clap our hands to thank them? Dear girls, a big kiss to you to thank you. Thank you very much.
Conference, so I should add, and I should end with a few words in English. I wish all of you, whether you came by plane or train or car, or even a bicycle, a very pleasant and a safe trip back home. I sincerely hope we'll have the opportunity to meet again one day here in what has become, for many of us, in a way a little bit our Prato. So thank you for your assistance, your kind cooperation, and goodbye. Buon ritorno, buon viaggio, grazie, arrivederci.
Have a safe trip back home. Thank you very much and goodbye.